So my whole life, I knew that I was destined to live in San Francisco. I remember when I was 13 years old, in 8th grade, drawing a picture of what my life would be like in San Francisco as an adult. It was this dream out before me, and in my early 20s, I had even tried to move to San Francisco, but somehow it ended up falling short and stopping in Austin, Texas for a few years. But, you know, I sort of collected myself, and in my late 20s, finally managed to just say, it's time. I'm going to go there. I'm going to move to San Francisco and live out there. And so I arrived without much of a plan and spent the nights on my friend Margaret's couch in her tiny apartment, and realized as I sort of settled in there that one, I would not ever be able to afford the rents that they were charging in San Francisco, and two, that Margaret's roommate was going to be hinting stronger and stronger that it was time for me to go. This set up a great conflict within me, and so I was relieved to hear of a reference for a place to live that I could afford. So I got the address, and it turned out to be in the Mission District. So I went down there to the Mission, right in downtown San Francisco, and found myself standing in front of this enormous, falling down, beautiful Victorian mansion. Think Addams Family. And it was surrounded by this tall chain link fence, atop of which ran a line of barbed wire. The gate of the fence was locked by a big truck chain held together by a padlock, and this also served as the doorbell. You had to shake the chain loudly enough against the fence until somebody from inside awakened or stirred enough to come out the door and down the steps to let you in. That was sort of how things worked in this house. So my very first time as I walked into this enormous house, I saw there was yellow tape above the grand staircase because they said if anybody got on it, the whole thing would fall down. And I slowly realized on my first day looking around that I had never been anywhere quite like this place. The people who owned this huge house and claimed to be restoring it were two people. One was a 6'10" bail bondsman with a shaved head. And the other was his partner, who was a woman who was about 6'3", who worked for the San Francisco Fire Department. A bail bondsman and a firefighter were my new roommates, and both of them much larger than me. They had recently come back. She was German, and they'd recently come back from touring around and vacationing around Germany, and he had taken the opportunity to have a custom-made set of lederhosen made for himself. And so this large man, over 400 pounds big and wide, would stride through this house with his lederhosen, sort of making small talk. It was surreal. To add to the effect was that they had brought some comfort to themselves by having made Viking furniture. So the tables were about this high, the chairs were this high, and the experience was like being at Alice in Wonderland, where at my full 5'9", I sort of had to hike myself up to join them for dinner. So this was the setting, and the reason that I was not expected to pay San Francisco rent rates was that they needed somebody to care for their dogs. They had 6 black dogs, 5 of them were Rottweilers, and then the 6th was a mutt. And they had constructed this beautiful place for the dog to play outside within that fenced-in area, except for one problem, which was that one of the neighbors had started shooting at the dogs whenever they'd gone outside, so it was no longer safe for the dogs to be out there. They had to be inside with a bail bondsman and a firefighter. Your schedules are kind of erratic, so they needed somebody there to take care of the dogs, and that person turned out to be none other than me. Now, how you fed the dogs was you'd go into the kitchen, and there was a big metal garbage can full of kibble, full of dog food, and there was a skillet stuck down in it, and you'd scoop up the dog food and throw a pile on the floor and then take a step way back as the 6 dogs got into this snarling pack of black fur to establish who would be the one to eat the first pile. And then you'd sort of lean in and throw down the second one, and again a fight with the remaining 5 dogs. And through this way, this process of elimination, all would be fed. The effect was made just beautiful, I think, by the fact that above this garbage can full of dog food, there was a large large bird cage with 2 birds within it, and the birds were terrorized by these snarling dogs. And so as the dogs would begin to snarl, the birds would crash and fly around in the bird cage, and every once in a while an errant feather would go floating gently down over the scene. So it really was beautiful and horrifying both at the same time. At night, because the neighbor and the shooting, the dogs couldn't be outside, and because of the main staircase that would fall down if anything got on it, the dogs had to sleep in my room. I was up on the 3rd floor in a small room with broken out windows that had been plugged with towels, and a small double bed. And so I would lie down at night, kind of cold, with a thin blanket over me, and it was then that the dogs would kind of pile on top of me, all 6 of them, 1, 2, 3, so that I had this sort of extra coat made of Rottweiler, a whole blanket of Rottweiler lying upon me, and that would have been actually pretty cozy. I got used to it, except that these dogs were terrified of mice. And so at 2 in the morning, at 4 in the morning, I would be awakened with a fright as the dogs began yelping and barking to hear the skittering of a mouse running under the bed. And it was in these moments, in the middle of the night, as I was awakened, that I wondered, what on earth have I gotten myself into? I'd started out with such great dreams there, moving to San Francisco, and thought that it would be my sort of natural habitat. And now I was finding, week after week, that I was the farthest thing from home that I could imagine. So I was pretty low. These were rough times. And it was about this time that I got a call from friends back in Iowa, and they said, well, we hear you're doing pretty badly back there, so we want to, invite you back, and you can cool off and be with us for a few days. Take it easy. I'd gone out with a lot of proclamations and a lot of bravado, so I was glad to be welcomed back without too much teasing. And so I took the Greyhound bus all the way from San Francisco, 2.5 days back to Iowa City, where I was, in fact, welcomed back. Now, if I had felt in San Francisco way behind the curve of what was considered hip, it was not so hard to pull off in the middle of Iowa. I had stories I could tell about San Francisco, names I could drop, that sort of thing. So, some of my ego was restored to go back there to the place of cornfields, and I was feeling pretty good until the last night that I was going to be there in Iowa City, and a friend of mine was having a costume party out at the old farmhouse where he lived. Well, of course, I hadn't brought a costume with me. I hadn't really known about this. So I took myself off to Joann's Fabric and got an armful of fake fur, fake brown fur, some red yarn, and some of those crochet circles, those plastic things that, with the grid on it, and decided that I was going to make myself a rabbit suit. Feet to head, complete full-on rabbit. And so I did. I sewed together this thick brown fur. I made myself a head that was made out of an unbound wire clothes hanger that I made for the armature of the head and the ears, and wrapped fur around that and made this beautiful rabbit suit. The eyes were made of these huge beaming crochet circles with blue magic markers and styrofoam for the buck teeth. I had a great time at that costume party, and I'm not sure exactly how it got started, but somehow through the course of that night, the rumor rose up that not only was I going to be a rabbit at this costume party, but the next day, if people showed up, I would be getting on the Greyhound bus dressed as a rabbit to travel all the way back to San Francisco. I don't know about you, but when I found myself in this kind of situation, being celebrated and slapped on the back for this daring do that I was purportedly going to attempt, I wasn't sure exactly how to back out of it. So the next day, as the bus was there waiting in the Iowa City bus station, I showed up with my suitcase, dressed toe to long ears as a rabbit, as a big brown rabbit with big buck teeth, and all of my friends were there. There were about 5 or 6 people who'd come out with delight, with glee, to see that this was really going to happen and make sure that it did. And I put my suitcase down and got up onto the bus, and I was waving, having a good time, going back to San Francisco, leaving you all behind here in Iowa, and sat down feeling pretty proud of myself. Well, the bus pulled off away from the station and out onto Highway I-80, and it was only then that I realized that I was dressed as a rabbit on a bus that was heading all the way across the country. And I hadn't thought too much about what came next. My suitcase, as I say, with the rest of my clothes was down under the bus. And at Des Moines, or perhaps even Omaha, I could have easily gotten out, taken the clothes, and changed into another outfit, more civilian attire. But I realized that I had a dilemma, and this was, would I rather be the guy who was dressed like a rabbit, or would I rather be the guy who used to be dressed like a rabbit? Because I had made up this understanding for myself that rabbits don't speak, right? I mean, everyone knows that. Rabbits don't speak. But if I was the guy who used to be dressed like a rabbit, I would draw all kinds of attention and questions and comments and be sort of drawn into speculations about my character that I just didn't want to welcome right then. And so it's probably the rare reason that would have you dressed as a rabbit in public for reasons of shyness. But in fact, this was what kept me dressed as a rabbit. I just didn't want to talk about it. And people who get on the I-80 westbound Greyhound bus are not puddle jumpers. These are people who are long-haul travelers. They were going all the way. So there was no hope that kind of the crowd would part and shift over or change. These were my people, and this was how it was going to be. This was an interesting psychology experiment I quickly discovered, because there are those, upon seeing someone dressed as a rabbit, who will approach you with a forlorn look in their eyes and wrap you up in a deep, long, and meaningful hug, whose power is of unknown provenance. These were people who had been needing comfort for an awfully long time. And so with my thick rabbit fur gloves, I would pat them on the back, sort of looking around. And then there are others, of course, who upon seeing someone dressed as a rabbit, see it as an invitation to a fight. And so there were these who would come up and get right into my face, right up near my big styrofoam buck teeth, wondering who exactly did I think I was, and what was this all about. And because rabbits don't talk, I was not able to answer them ever, but instead could just sort of hop from foot to foot and hope to sort of lighten up the situation and de-escalate a little bit until I could somehow extricate myself from the conflict. And this is sort of how it went, and I tried to have some fun with it. There was a stop in Nebraska where I actually made a few nickels and dimes doing a little soft shoe out near the bus, and people seemed to enjoy that. But also it was increasingly difficult, especially as night wore on. You'll remember that the headpiece was made out of bent clothes hanger, and it was pressing in on my head in a way that was bringing on a terrible headache. And it also kept my head at an angle that I never could fully sleep there on the bus. I had at the time an autobiography of Nelson Mandela, about 300 pages, and so I thought, well, maybe reading is a way I can get through this predicament that I put myself in. And so I lifted up this big heavy book about Nelson Mandela, but I, with my furry paws, couldn't really turn the pages, and with the crochet grids in front of my eyes, I couldn't ever really see that well. And so I had to give up reading and just sort of consign myself to the discomfort. There were some poignant moments, and maybe if you've dressed as a rabbit, you'll have experienced these kinds of moments yourselves. There was one at this small town in Wyoming. By this point in the trip, I'd gotten in the habit, when the group of people got off the bus and went into McDonald's or wherever, I would make my way to as far away from them as I could. So I crossed the street at this place and went into this truck stop and was looking around for the chewing gum there in that aisle when I heard this sort of elderly cowboy type come up to the cashier and begin to talk about how the previous Saturday he had lost his wife of many years. And you know, this real sharing in this gruff voice with, you know, this halting way. And I thought to myself there in the gum aisle, you know, I don't want to miss the bus pulling away, but at the same time, in the middle of this beautiful, poignant moment between cowboys, for a huge 5'9" rabbit to suddenly appear wanting to pay for his gum would just ruin the whole thing. So I had to hide, and luckily did make the bus. There was another moment where things got a little bit out of control, or almost did, on this sort of snow-covered plain where we stopped, this parking lot, where I heard someone say, "Let's get the rabbit." And these two good old boys started throwing snowballs at the rabbit, and I had to really run as fast as I could around the bus and then back up into the Greyhound and go to my seat, and hoping that they wouldn't come after me. So this is without sleep, this is with a splitting headache, this is without being able to move very well or to feel very comfortable for now 2.5 days. And we finally reached the Sacramento bus stop at about 2:30 in the morning. And I don't know if this is a low point or a high point in my life, but I know it's one, because I had finally managed to accomplish some kind of light sleep when two women got onto the bus there at 2:30 in the morning in Sacramento. And they started carrying on and shouting, saying, "Look, there's a rabbit's on the bus." Now, remember, I had been trying to greet people in a friendly way with kind of a hopping from side to side, but there was something about just having awoken and pulling from the seat in front of me that I must have launched myself forward in a menacing way, because the next thing I knew, these women were backing down the aisle saying, "Whoa, whoa, rabbit, it's okay." And the bus driver was getting in front of us saying, "No, he's with us, he's okay," giving that kind of assurance. It was early morning when we got to the San Francisco bus stop finally, and I got off bedraggled, my suit, my costume soiled more than it had been when I'd gotten on, and began walking my way with my suitcase up Market Street in downtown San Francisco against the tide of business people dressed in crisp business attire walking in the other direction, sort of parting the sea, all the way back to the Mission District, where I shook the truck chain, asking to be let back in, and was allowed back into this old crumbling down mansion. And the dogs came snarling up to greet me, and the bail bondsman and the firefighter were there, and I realized that at long last I was truly at home.